how much of a mandate went with this election. The next slides that I have are exit polling slides, and for you political junkies, I would I've included these slides. I'm not going to spend much time on them. You can look at them. I'm sure that Joe will send them the PowerPoint around to everybody that was in attendance on this call, and you can just kind of look at some of this exit polling. But I would encourage you to get the actual exit polls off the internet. It's about 18 pages. It really, for political junkies, it's very, very interesting. They're pretty easy to read if you just look at the first category of gender. If you look over in the right-hand column, what that says is that of the people voting, 47% were male, 53% female, and then it gives you the breakdown of the men. 52% voted for Romney, 45% for Obama, female, 55% Obama, 44% Romney, and you can read all of these tables in that fashion. There are some, I just found it all interesting. I'll just point out one on the bottom of that page. When you look at the last grade of school completed, the only category that Romney won was the college graduate. He lost all of the other categories, including postgraduate study, and then everybody who either had no high school diploma or just a high school diploma or some college. So there's a lot of interesting material on these slides, and feel free to look through them at your leisure. With respect to the Senate, the Democrats control the Senate. They gained strength in the Senate. This was an election when most people here in Washington thought there was a very good chance the Republicans would gain seats and could even recapture control of the Senate. So this came as a surprise. There's a whole group of reasons why this turned out this way, but nevertheless, this is the result. And in the 112th Congress we're still in, the Democrats have 53 effectively in the House, and the Republicans have 47 members. In the 113th Congress, the Democrats are going to increase by 2, and so they're going to really have a 55 to 45 advantage on the Senate side. And, you know, the question will be, and this will affect some of the transportation issues, is how emboldened or assertive will the Senate Democrats be? You can see a little of it now with Senator Reid saying that he wants to change the filibuster rules at the outset of the Congress to allow for less ability to filibuster. There have been some quotes in the paper dealing with the fiscal cliff saying we'll force the House Republicans to take it, coming from a senior leadership aide. So, you know, part of this is, as it plays out, is how assertive will the Democrats be given what took place in the election and the fact that they have 2 additional votes over what they had in the 112th Congress. But also, they may not be as assertive as one might think, because they may be looking at 2014. Many analysts think that in 2014, the Republicans actually have an even better chance than they had and blew in 2012. The Democrats are defending more seats, and some of the more vulnerable Democratic senators are in states that voted for that basically voted more conservative than other states, and so these are viewed as states where there's a very good chance of a potential Republican pickup. So this will be something to watch as to see how it plays out on the Senate side. On the House side, the Republicans retain control, but again, on the House side, there was good news for the Democrats. They did gain seats. They picked up a total of 8 seats, so it looks like there's still a couple of seats that are still outstanding, but it looks like the numbers are going to be 234 Republicans, 201 for Democrats in the 113th Congress, which is down from where it was in the 112th Congress at 242 to 193. Since the House is a majoritarian body where the majority rules, it means that Republicans using the Rules Committee, using the power that the Speaker has, should be able to retain control. And in some respects, it won't be that different than what occurred in the 112th Congress. The difference is when you do have a partisan vote where the two parties are voting, kind of as a block. In the 112th Congress, 24 Republicans would have to defect to the Democratic side, assuming all Democrats voted for something, in order for the Republican leadership to lose. In the 113th Congress, that's going to be reduced to 16. So in that respect, the Republican leadership is not going to be able to have as many defections as they had in the 112th Congress and still prevail on votes. The real question here as to how this is all going to play out between the executive, the Senate, and the House. There are some who think that the President and the Senate Democrats will really try to isolate and marginalize the House Republicans, that it's going to really be very partisan these next 2 years, because their goal is going to be to recapture the House in 2014 and then attempt to have an all-Democratic Washington for the last 2 years of the President's term. On the other at the other end of the spectrum, there are those who think that no, the President is really going to provide leadership and work with the Senate and the House to bring about bicameral, bipartisan agreements on the major issues facing the Congress, like the fiscal cliff and long-term budget crisis. So, only time is going to tell which of these two it is, or whether it's just something in between. But that's where the tension is really going to be. There's going to be some people who say, boy, we can recapture the House. We can, blame the House Republicans for all sorts of things and then take the House back in 2014. Others are going to be saying, no, we need to rise above that and work out real agreements with the two bicameral, bipartisan agreements. Another aspect of the election is that there are going to be a lot of new freshmen, 95 new freshmen in the House and the Senate, which is substantially higher than if you look back at 2005, 2007, 2009. It's less than the big change that took place in 2011, but nevertheless, it still is a lot of new members. And if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that you're going to have about 54% of the members have served 6 years or less, are relatively new to the Congress. And what that means is just the need for greater education of the members as to how the programs work and the like. And so a lot of new members, a lot of education is going to need to be done over the next couple of years. With respect to transportation, Secretary LaHood, there have always been rumors that he is leaving, but I just talked to somebody who had a discussion with him, and it looks like he might be staying for a while. I don't think it'll be a long time, but I don't think he's going to be leaving imminently based on what I've heard recently. And so I would put him in kind of the second wave of changes that might be made. There are a lot of high-profile changes that are going to be made in the next few weeks and months or so, but he'll probably come in a wave after that. On the Senate side, the Democratic chairman of the committees of the EPW committee will continue to be Senator Boxer. Senator Rockefeller on the Senate Commerce Committee. But on the Republican side, there'll be new people. Senator Vitter from Louisiana will be replacing Senator Inhofe as the ranking member on the EPW committee, and Senator DeMint, one of the leaders of the Tea Party movement, will be replacing Senator Hutchison as ranking member on the Commerce Committee. On the House side, the big change there is that Congressman Schuster, the son of Congressman Bud Schuster, who chaired the committee back in the late 90s. His son has now moved to the position where he has been chosen to chair the committee, so he will be replacing Congressman Micah as the chairman of the T&I committee. Now let's look at the fiscal cliff, and I'm going to try to go through and kind of give you an understanding of all of these issues surrounding the fiscal cliff, and it is very confusing. It's confusing for Washington insiders, and I'm sure it's confusing for everybody that's out there throughout the country who are picking up the papers and trying to make sense out of what's happening. And this is very important because this is going to have or could have a very important impact on transportation funding. And so that's the reason to try to get a feel for this, because the transportation community is going to be quite active in this effort. Let's start with kind of the fiscal context of where the nation's finances stand, because that's kind of the starting point to understanding the fiscal cliff and the debates surrounding it. This is a chart basically that shows federal spending in fiscal year 2012 that just ended. On the left-hand side is what the government is spending, and you can see there that the federal government spent about $3.6 trillion in fiscal year 2012. And the bottom three bars of the chart, the blue is Social Security, the red is Medicare and Medicaid, and then the orange are other entitlements. You can see that these entitlement programs really were over 50% of the spending that took place in 2012. And above that in green is the defense spending. Purple is the other domestic spending that comes through the Appropriations Committee, things like transportation, EPA, all of the other federal agencies, HUD and the like, come up in the purple. And then the blue layer on the very top are the interest payments we pay on the national debt. And on the right-hand side is a bar graph that shows the revenues in fiscal year 2012. The revenues were $2.52 trillion in fiscal year 2012, which means that the deficit in 2012 was about $1.1 trillion. So the federal government is running a very, very high current services deficit, and that is one of the issues that the Congress is facing, is to how to deal with the current annual deficits that Congress is running. Now, if you look at the chart on the left, the spending chart, just take a look at that blue graph, that blue bar on Social Security, the red one on Medicare, and then on the very top, the lighter blue one, almost turquoisey one on interest payments. Because I'm going to show you on this next slide what's going to happen to those segments going forward. And as you look at the federal budget long term on the spending side, you see very dramatic increases. The chart in the upper left corner is what happens to Medicare as you project out into the future. And so all the way over on the left is where we are now in basically 2012. And then if you look at it's projected out, you can see this vast, huge growth in Medicare. And so that part of the bar chart on spending is going to grow dramatically because Medicare costs are going to grow dramatically over the coming years. If you look at the chart in the upper right-hand corner, that's Social Security. And if you look at that, you can see the dramatic increase as the baby boomers retire in the costs that are going to be associated with Social Security because of the aging population growing so from where it is in 2010 to where it's going to be through the next 20 to 30 years. So you're going to have huge growth in that bar on the chart that dealt with Social Security. And then if you look at, because of the debt that's being piled up, if you look at the chart that's on the bottom, you see projections of the interest rates from where they are in 2012 There's two different projections. What they have in common is that there's dramatic increase in the interest payments because the government will have accumulated so much debt over time. So these three charts are just an indication of how the spending is going to skyrocket going forward. As a result, the federal debt explodes. I mean, it's just an enormous projected increase in the debt that the public would hold, and so that is a real issue for the overall fiscal condition of the country moving forward. It's a security issue as well. In addition to the fact that having that much debt, weakens our economy, there's also an issue that, as you can see here, in 2011, which is, I think, is the last date that they have there, over 50% of the debt that's being held was being held by foreigners. So not only do we have this large debt basically weakening our economy, but we also have the fact that much of this debt are held by foreigners, which from a security point of view is not the best situation to be in. So to summarize on the overall fiscal condition we face, we really have a short-term and a long-term fiscal challenges. In the short term, we're running these very high deficits, $1 trillion or more. That's adding to the debt and the debt service. And then in the longer term, we have these unsustainable entitlements that we saw, the Social Security, the Medicare, and the interest payments, huge increases in those, which again are going to continue to force high deficits and a mushrooming debt and debt service costs. And so this is the cloud that hangs over our fiscal condition of the federal government, and why you hear so many people talking about there being a problem. Well, most people think that this is the time to act now to get our fiscal house in order. And you can do that by either increasing revenues to pay for all of that spending that we saw, or you can cut that spending back to what the revenues are, or you can do a combination of both, where you increase revenues, but you also cut spending and bring the two in line so that we're on a sound fiscal policy. Fixing these short-term and long-term problems is often referred to as the grand bargain. So when you hear these discussions in Washington about are they going to do the grand bargain, or when are they going to do the grand bargain, what is the grand bargain going to look like, what they're talking about is these changes, and usually they're talking about both revenues and reducing spending that will basically put us on a course that will be sustainable. And in order to do that, you have to raise revenues, which is something the Republicans really have not wanted to do, and you have to cut entitlement spending and bring that down to something that's more controllable, something the Democrats have not wanted to do. So in order to make this happen, both sides have to give significantly and come to a real bicameral, bipartisan agreement on a package that will provide those kinds of changes. Under that last bullet also, sometimes you'll hear people talk about a down payment on the grand bargain. What that means, what they're talking about there is, well, they're not going to do the full package, they're not going to do all of the revenue other people have said, the head of the Congressional Budget Office, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve have said about how serious this problem is and how important it is that Congress address this and enact some sort of grand bargain that fixes the problem. And so it's against that background of the overall dimensions of what the federal fiscal policy looks like today and what has to be done to fix it, it's against that background that this discussion of the so-called fiscal cliff is taking place. And this chart is just something that kind of shows some of the key dates. It was election day. Then in the yellow you can see the kind of the lame duck session that Congress is having now, which will run till the end of the year. And the two things that will happen that are referred to as the fiscal cliff is on December 31st the number of tax policies will expire and taxes will go up. And then by law on January 2nd, this last sequestration that Congress agreed to last year, which we'll talk about, that will also take effect. So this combination of the increase in taxes from expiring tax provisions coupled with the sequestration taking effect is what people talk about when they talk about this fiscal cliff. Another date that's sitting out there, which I really won't spend too much time on this call on, is that the debt ceiling. And it's estimated that somewhere in late February or early March, Congress will have to raise the debt ceiling or the United States will default, and that will be another triggering event where Congress has to act in some fashion and pass some sort of bill to do that. And so that will be, now if there's some agreement made in the next few weeks, the debt ceiling increase could be included in that, but that's another piece that's on the horizon here that will have to be dealt with. So we're going to kind of focus and look at what are these expiring tax policies, what is the sequestration that's going to take effect. And the tax increases that will take effect January 1st is the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. And so that would apply to most everybody in the country in fiscal year. In 2013, it's about $156 billion is at stake. There's also expiration of the payroll tax holiday that was enacted a couple of years ago, and that's another $125 billion increase. There's no patch for the alternative minimum tax, so that tax will start to affect more taxpayers than it affects now if that's not reenacted, and that will be an additional $88 billion roughly. There's a whole series of business expensing provisions and other tax extenders, which is about $88 billion. There are new health care taxes that take effect on that date, as well as an estate tax increase. So this combination of taxes will all take effect on January 1st if something isn't done about it. In addition to that, if you'll remember, in the last year when the debt ceiling came up for extension, there was a package of spending cuts that were included in that, and there was this $2 trillion that was turned over to the super committee to come up with a proposal. And as you all probably remember, that super committee couldn't come up with anything. They failed in their mission, and as a result of that, this sequestration took effect. That would be effective January 2nd of 2013 to give Congress time to change it, because the sequestration was considered too draconian for Congress to actually ever let take effect, and so that this would force the super committee to come up with something, or if they failed, would force Congress to come up with something to replace it, because they would never let this go into effect. Well, lo and behold, super committee failed. Congress has not acted to change this, so that sequestration will take effect on January 2nd if something isn't done. What the part of this that is kind of quote unquote too draconian is, first, half of it comes from defense and half from non-defense, and so defense, half of it coming from defense is actually a higher percentage than they would pay if it was just pro rata. So there's more coming from defense than would be the case if it was just spread out. But the thing that's really creating a problem is the way that sequestration works in 2013. It works differently in 2014 and beyond, but in 2013, it's applied uniformly across accounts, so that if you took the defense budget, they've got to cut $55 billion. Let's pretend that $55 billion were 10% of the defense budget. That means each of the funding categories in defense get cut by 10%. And what the Defense Department says is, that's crazy. Some of these programs can't be cut. We need to keep the full spending there, and we could cut others more. We could cut others maybe 20%, so that we could meet this target. It's still a high target, and we don't think we should lose that much money. But if we had more flexibility to be able to take bigger chunks from some categories and protect other categories, we could at least make it work better. And so that is the fact that it's applied uniformly and there's no ability to shift around between spending categories has created a problem. And the same is true in the non-defense area, where there's a lot of, if there were more flexibility with how you handle the appropriated accounts, people might feel more comfortable with it. So this sequestration, the way it's currently structured, is viewed by many to be a problem. But to give you some effect, I mean, these are called, this overall tax increase and spending reduction is called, a big problem. But to put it in perspective, if you did all of this, the deficit would still be $641 billion. So even doing all of the things that are proposed only gets you kind of a partial solution of the current deficit. And of course, it doesn't really do anything for entitlement reform or for tax reform, and so it doesn't address the big questions. It just really kind of cuts down on the current deficit, but even there, by only about half. In addition, even with that sequester, that reduction of $110 billion, federal spending would still increase in fiscal year 2013, so that the sequester is simply reducing the size of the increase. It's not really cutting spending below fiscal year 2012 levels, and so that's another aspect of this, just to give you a sense of the perspective of what these cuts mean or don't mean. Well, why are people getting hysterical about this fiscal cliff then? And the real reason is that the economy is very fragile, and almost all the economists that look at this say that the combination of this big increase in taxes coupled with these spending cuts could push the economy into a recession, another recession. CBO has indicated that the unemployment could exceed 9%, and so that's the reason for the concern here, is that were these tax increases allowed to take effect in their full form, and were this sequestration to take effect, that the economy would slip back into recession and unemployment would once again go up when if anything, it needs to come down. It's still at too high a level. So that's the fear. That's what's driving people in Washington here to say we got to fix this. But is it being overhyped? You know, what really happens? And the fact is that on day one, at least in theory, nothing dramatic really happens. The tax rates go up, and so if they stayed in effect for the full year, the taxes that people pay would have to be a lot higher. But Congress could fix it early in 2013. They could pass a bill in January or February or March. They could make the taxes retroactive to the start of the year so that the taxes, whatever tax relief they provided, was right from the beginning of the year. They could do the same thing on the spending side. They could basically, if they were going to restore part of the sequestered amounts, they could basically restore those because it's affecting the current fiscal year. So Congress could fix all of these things in January, February, March, and you really wouldn't have a very dramatic effect, really, and no different than really fixing it beforehand if they fix it over the next few weeks. The problem is more in the psychology and the planning that if these take effect and people don't have confidence that Congress is going to fix it because they didn't fix it in the lame duck session, then people could start taking actions with what they do with their money, whether they cancel planned projects and other kinds of things like that, and that would then hurt the economy because psychologically businesses were moving in a direction of cutting back. And of course, you know, the politicians are always going to be looking at who gets blamed politically for this. Is this going to be, as I mentioned before, some think that President Obama and the Senate Democrats might want to go over the cliff because they feel Republicans would get blamed for it. Republicans, I'm sure, have got their own view of this, of how this could play out. So, you know, one of the calculations just from a political point of view is who would get blamed. I don't think anybody is going to really want to have this happen because of the uncertainty, even though they can come back and fix it and it really shouldn't have any big impact. Just that whole question of the psychology and the planning and decisions that people might start to make, and you know, even potentially, you know, any panic that could occur in the stock market as a result of this, because people would be fearful that they wouldn't be able to fix it and it would stay in effect all year, and then you would have the impact of those taxes and reduced spending, if CBO is correct, would have an adverse effect on the economy if it were maintained over the year. And so in some respects it's not as bad as it's being portrayed, in other respects though it could be. So what can happen, you know, what's out there that people are talking about? And you know, anybody that says they know what's going to happen, you know, I don't think, you know, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. I think insiders in Washington are kind of confident that something is going to happen in the lame duck that's going to take care of this, but I don't think anybody really knows for sure how this is all going to play out. But here's kind of a range of options. One is that you could have the grand bargain itself. You could really set the federal budget on a long-term sustainable course. That would mean a big tax reform package, one that would provide additional revenues, coupled with entitlement reform where Medicare, Social Security were scaled back in some fashion to make them sustainable. The across-the-board sequestration would be dealt with in some fashion, and this would be called the grand bargain, getting this done now. I don't think anybody thinks that can happen in the lame duck itself, and that's because tax reform, entitlement reform are just going to take too much time. There's not enough time left in the lame duck to actually have the full deal all done, wrapped with a bow and passed by the end of December. So then people talk about, well, maybe they can do a grand bargain light, and what that would be is you would put in place some sort of enforceable targets and a process that will get you the grand bargain in 2013. So it would be some kind of automatic process that would force Congress to act. There would be enforceable targets in there of some sort, both for additional revenues and for entitlement reform benefit reductions. And you would then either kick the can down the road on the fiscal cliff or make some minor adjustments to fix the fiscal cliff. And something like that could pass in the lame duck, which would really do a few things in the lame duck, but would really set up a process to ensure that Congress, or try to ensure that Congress actually produces a real grand bargain in 2013. Something like that is doable with the amount of time that's left. I mean, this is clearly one option that if the President and Senate and the House and Republicans and Democrats really sat down and rolled their sleeves up, they could do something like that. Another thing you hear is that they'll just do some sort of down payment on the grand bargain. They won't do a big grand bargain now. They'll really just take some of the Simpson Bowles reforms, maybe get some more revenue from the rich, somehow modify sequestration so it's not quite as onerous, and that's what they'll pass, and it'll just be kind of a partial loaf. And that is, I think, a distinct possibility. Another thing you hear is they'll just kick the can down the road. They'll just won't be able to come to any agreement, and so what they'll do is they'll extend everything for 2, 3, 4 months to give the new Congress a chance to deal with these issues. And that might include maybe just a few things, like more revenue from the rich would be tacked into this. It wouldn't just be extending everything. The next option would be to really just kick the can down the road. Don't have any changes in it. Just extend everything a few months so that Congress has a chance to deal with it. The problem with that option, though, is it would require the President to sign a bill which actually has an increase in taxes doesn't increase the taxes for the rich, which he has said he will not do. So it's hard to see how that option. And then the last one is to kind of go over the fiscal cliff, just not act, and then come back in 2013 and very quickly in January, February, try to make the changes that are necessary and make them retroactive to January 1st. But again, that's a risky proposition because the psychology of what might happen might actually start to trigger the recession, even though Congress really does intend to come back and fix it. So this is kind of the range of options. Again, I don't think there's time to do the grand bargain, so I think that's out. I think just straight kicking the can down the road is very unlikely because President Obama said he wouldn't do that. And so it really puts you in one of these other options. I kind of am with the optimist that it won't go over the fiscal cliff, which means that the options 2, 3, and 4 up there would be some variation of one of those that would be the most likely thing to happen. So now let's talk about, we see the fiscal cliff, we see what the situation in the overall economy is, how the fiscal cliff, the options for dealing with it, that something's going to happen in the lame duck and something's going to happen in 2013 to address those issues. Well, transportation has its own fiscal cliff. As you all know, MAP 21 passed, reauthorized the programs through September of 2014, had significant policy reforms in it, but it did not address the long-term financial viability of the Highway Trust Fund. And just as a reminder, the revenue provisions that were included in MAP 21, basically there was not enough money in the Highway Trust Fund to support current levels of spending, which was really just an extension of the levels from Safety Lou. And so Congress had to actually put $22.2 billion into the trust fund. $2.4 billion came from the Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund, but $18.8 billion came from general funds. that were needed to bail out the Highway Trust Fund, and that's on top of the $35 billion from the general fund that had bailed the trust fund out previously. And then there were offsets put in there so that this general fund money transferred in wouldn't increase the deficit, and so they had some offsets dealing with pension funding stabilization and a few other items. What this means is, because they didn't fix the long-term problem, what this means is that the Highway Trust Fund is projected to just barely make it through 2014. And when Congress gets ready to do the next bill, let's say they were going to do a 5-year bill from 2015 through 2019, if you look all the way down the bottom of the chart, they're going to be about $62 billion short. And it's actually even worse than this, because this chart was prepared before they announced the new CAFE standards, which are even more stringent. And so my guess is that's going to adversely affect revenues starting sometime during this period. So that it really is going to be more than $62 billion. I wouldn't be surprised if we were looking at $75 to $80 billion was needed to do the next bill. And so what that means is you've got to come up with that money, or you've got to cut the program back. And this is just one thing AASHTO did, where you have a dramatic reduction in the program in 2015, and then it would come back up, but not at the current levels. It would take a long time to get back up to even the current levels of spending. Nothing like this, I don't believe, Congress wouldn't allow this to happen, but it gives you a sense of how dramatic the change might be and what impact it could have because of the fact that there's this shortfall in the trust fund. Obviously, there's a lot at stake. If this investment were not made, I mean, there needs to be increased investment, not a reduced investment, but our freight system will become more unreliable. Businesses will have difficulty competing. People will be stuck in congestion more. So this failure to invest in our transportation infrastructure is going to hurt our economy and hurt the quality of life of American citizens. So what are the options for dealing with the shortfall in the trust fund? Well, this is an immediate cash problem that the trust fund will face in this Congress as it gets ready to look at 2015, a bill that might be from 2015, 4 years, 5 years, whatever the bill turns out to be. And obviously one approach is to get more money from the general fund. I mean, just go back to the general fund and get another bailout and have another offset. People have said they aren't going to do that again, but they said that before, and it seems to continue to happen. So, you know, maybe that's the way to go. Raising motor fuel taxes is a way to get money into the trust fund quickly that could make up that deficit by increasing the gas tax, increasing the tax on diesel fuel, and so that's one way to do it. Another tax on oil could be implemented. Instead of increasing the motor fuel excise tax, have some sort of other production tax on oil. A carbon tax on at least transportation could generate money quickly to get into the trust fund. Production royalties that the House Republican leadership had talked about in MAP 21, that might help in the long range, but that is not going to produce the revenue that's needed to shore up the trust fund in 2015, 2018 timeframe. A lot of other alternative financing gets talked about, tolling, PPPs, VMT tax, other types of things. None of those will actually put money in the trust fund, or to the extent they might put money in the trust fund, they're not going to be ready in the time frame that we're talking about. So to provide real relief for the trust fund, you've really got to come up with something that's in that first list that's going to be able to be implemented quickly and is going to provide the kinds of revenues that are needed, which again is up in that $65 to $80 billion range. So let's look at what's likely then to happen with transportation, given what we've got here with all this emphasis on the fiscal cliff and the grand bargain, and then the transportation facing its own fiscal cliff. One issue that has to be dealt with in this Congress is the Highway Trust Fund solvency, because they're going to have a bill by the end of 2014 to reauthorize the program. And there'd really be two ways to deal with the Highway Trust Fund solvency. One is to hitch a ride on the grand bargain or fiscal cliff deal. Whatever happens in the lame duck and or in 2013 to deal with those, make the issue of fixing the Highway Trust Fund, making it solvent, have a piece in that bill. Or it would have to be as part of a standalone effort along with the reauthorization bill, where when the reauthorization bill was done, there would be an attempt at that point to somehow make the Highway Trust Fund solvent, either through increasing the motor fuel taxes or some sort of general fund bailout again. There are precedents for hitching a ride and doing things in the lame duck. Many of you may remember President Reagan actually supported a highway user tax increase in a lame duck session, so there's precedent for dealing with these kinds of issues in a lame duck. And the highway user fees have been addressed in previous budget deals, as we'll see. And in addition, some of the proposals that have been made as kind of down payments on the grand bargain, the Simpson-Bowles effort, and the Gang of Six proposals that have been made in the Senate, they both addressed Highway Trust Fund revenue issues. So there have been some precedents in just what has been done on this issue here. And then I wanted to show you this chart that I had prepared a while back for showing how the 18.4 cents gas tax came about. And if you see at the top there in the portions that are kind of, they come across as kind of diagonal bars, actually the last 4.3 cents and then 2.5 cents, half of the increase before that, all were for deficit reduction first, and then ultimately got transferred over to the Highway Trust Fund. And so the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990, the Reconciliation Act of 1993, the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997, all these bills all had provisions in them that related to and dealt with the highway user fees, and so there is clearly precedent for a big grand bargain kind of bill or a fiscal cliff bill, including in it provisions dealing with the highway user fees. So in addition to that, and so I think you'll see that a lot of the transportation community is going to be trying to become involved in, both in the lame duck and 2013, all of the discussions on the grand bargain and the fiscal cliff, because they'll want to use that as the vehicle to obtain the increases that are necessary to make the Highway Trust Fund solvent. Whatever it turns out to be, Congress might come up with, whatever way that they decide to deal with it, that a good vehicle are those budget vehicles, rather than waiting and trying to do it as part of just a standalone transportation bill all by itself. In addition to that, in the start of this 113th Congress, there's always the danger that because all this general fund money is going into the trust fund, has been used to bail it out over the last number of years, that somebody will say, well, you don't really need a trust fund anymore. You shouldn't get the special budgetary treatment that you get because it's no longer a user-financed program. And so there may be some attempts to undo the special budgetary treatment that the trust fund gets. In addition to that, right now, sequestration doesn't hit the transportation programs all that much because they are funded out of a trust fund. But if Congress puts a substitute program in for sequestration, which they have done once before, that did affect transportation. So if there's something that's, if all domestic programs, discretionary programs get cut by about 6%, 7%, 8% as part of the deal that's made, then the odds are, that, at least by how it's been handled in the past, that that would affect transportation, even though the current sequestration really doesn't do much on to transportation. So there's a danger of a cutback of 6, 7, 8, 9% at the start of the 113th Congress that'll have to be dealt with. In addition, MAP 21, as you all know, has many provisions in it that are going to have to be implemented by the administration through rulemaking, through guidance, and so there'll be a lot of activity watching how the administration implements the changes in MAP 21, especially the changes intended to speed up project delivery and reduce the amount of time it takes to plan and bring projects online. And then right around the corner in political terms is the reauthorization. That has to be completed by September 30th of 2014 before the next election. The program expires then if it's not, and so Congress will have to do something in this Congress. I think one thing they'll be looking at are the reforms. How have they worked? Has DOT implemented them properly? Another question is, are earmarks going to be back in play? Speaker Boehner talked about there have been problems in eliminating the earmarks, the good ones, and in a number of different areas. And so he has talked about the possibility of there being a bicameral, bipartisan commission in the House and Senate to come up with a different way of dealing with earmarks to allow some to come back in where they are justified. And so earmarks could be back in play on this. And then, of course, the financing issues, making sure that the Highway Trust Fund is solvent and can at least support the current levels of spending, which again would take an infusion of about $65 to $80 billion for a 5-year bill. But of course, this program actually needs an increase in spending, so trying to find the revenues to do that is going to be a major effort. I know that incoming chairman of the House Transportation Committee is very focused on these issues and trying to find a way to ensure the long-term solvency of the trust fund. So that's the presentation on the election, on the overall fiscal cliff and transportation's fiscal cliff, and then what kinds of issues transportation is going to be facing. Again, I think that one of the things, again, this is something the new chairman is going to be focused on, but is trying to continue to educate people on how important transportation is to our competitiveness in today's global marketplace, to economic growth. Our economy simply can't grow at the levels it needs to grow without upgrading our transportation system, and what transportation means for long-term job growth in the private sector, because that growing economy produces private sector jobs. Of course, transportation also has the benefit of providing for construction jobs at the time the projects are going forward, but that's not a justification for doing a project just because it creates jobs. These are needed transportation facilities, and they create many more jobs in the long term because of the private sector growth that's able to take place because of having a first-rate transportation network. So with that, I would be more than pleased to answer any questions that anybody has, and I trust that Joe will be able to, or Duffy or Michael will be able to make it available to you, a copy of the PowerPoint if you want it. So with that, I'm ready for questions.
I've got one I just need to get to here. Okay, the question that did come up was one about obtaining the slides and the presentation to listen to it again. We plan to put that up on www.ptpblog.com. ptpblog.com. Expect to have both the presentation and a video with audio of the entire presentation. That was the only question that I've received. If you have some
that means everybody understood it, or everybody is so confused that they don't have any questions.
Well, one never knows. But we appreciate your time in coming and being with us. We plan to continue this series and look forward to working with all of you in the future to better transportation. Looks like I just got a couple more questions, so let me get to them. Just one comment: excellent presentation. Real good, no questions. So I think we're at the point of closing.
Those are the kind of questions I like.
Yes, Jack, you're excellent as usual.
But and if anybody wants additional information beyond, feel free to call me. I know this was an awful lot of material to try to put in one presentation. Each one of these sections could have had a whole webinar done on it by itself. And so if there's anybody that wants to go into any of these questions in more depth, just feel free to, Joe, if they let you know, we can arrange for something in the way of a more depth look at some of these subject areas.
All right. Well, thank you very much, all of you, and again, Jack.
Okay.